You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 373, Revelation 7, part 2. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, what's going on?
Well, we have had a new development here in Florida.
Okay.
My wife, Drina, has declared war on 2 ducks in our backyard. The ducks like to land in the pool and do what ducks do. Okay, they poop in the pool. They walk around the sidewalk and poop on the sidewalk. They eat this. There's nothing in the pool to eat, but they eat the seeds that drop from a bird feeder near the pool. So it's funny. This morning, it's been like every morning for a week now. Okay, first thing she does, get out of bed, look out the window. The ducks are here again. She's gone. Gotta go chase
What do you
the
do?
ducks
Shoot them
out.
away? I mean, because she shoot them away? Do
No.
they leave,
I mean,
or they just look at her
you gotta,
like, lady, this is my pool.
You got to
What do
sort
they
of get, yeah, they do. You got to sort of get after them. I mean, they won't respond just to yelling, or even barking. The dogs will go out there and bark at them. But if you get the skimmer after them, then they'll fly away. So we've looked it up, and the thing that is recommended that boats do to keep birds off, like yachts, from landing on the yachts and stuff like that, and doing the same thing, is to get a rubber snake.
Yeah.
And put that by the pool or in the pool. So we're going to try that and see if that's a duck deterrent. I mean, we've got the owl there for the raccoons. That keeps we haven't had a raccoon show up for a couple of months now. So the owl works for the raccoons, but the ducks could care less.
Yeah.
So they need another predator. Threat.
Yeah, snakes will do it. I remember my grandparents at their carport, they had a bunch of rubber snakes tied up around their carport, I guess, to keep the birds off too. So that memory just popped in my brain right now when you said that. So that's good. So where are you going?
And of course, my kids think Drina's the villain. Oh, the ducks are so pretty. Let the ducks alone. It's like, the ducks are pooping in the pool. Okay, so let's get rid of the ducks. So I'm on Drina's side. Obviously, I don't want ducks pooping in the pool, but it is funny. I have to admit that.
Yeah. Did you name the ducks?
No, we haven't named them yet.
Oh, yeah.
That's a good idea. If I bring that up, though, tonight maybe, I'm sure we'll get some candidates.
Well, let us know where y'all land, because
yeah, no pun intended, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cute.
We'll see if the ducks are there a week from now.
Yeah,
she's going to go out and get the rubber snake, and I got to tell her, look, don't get a little one. Like, get something 5-6 feet long so that they don't miss it, and just leave it out there and see if it works.
Yeah. Doesn't Florida, don't y'all have a ton of like wild pythons and whatnot roaming around?
I'm sure there's, I'm sure there's some. I mean, the kids have seen some, 1 or 2 on the trails, because by the walking trails here, there's water, these, I don't know if you even call them a creek, but they flow. There's a lot of ponds around here, so you'll see them every now and then.
Yeah.
But they scatter. Yeah. They're not really a threat unless you do something stupid like try to chase one down. But you'll see them every now and then.
Yeah, we have a pool too, and only thing we get now and then are frogs and turtles. So I'll open the basket covers, and you'll just see turtles, little baby turtles in there spinning. And so we tried to we tried to keep them. We actually made a little turtle habitat kind of outside in our backyard in the attempts to raise them and grow them. But these little baby red ear sliders, I think they're called, they keep escaping. And of course, they're not going back into the pool. I don't know where they're going, but they're disappearing on us. But we've had a couple of frogs, and trying to catch a frog. Have you ever seen a frog swim underwater? It's amazing how good a swimmer they are. Yeah, but I'm trying to catch them with their net, and their little frog legs are kind of freaky the way they swim, and it's just, I don't know, something about trying to catch a frog as it's swimming full speed is kind of weird.
Well, if this doesn't work, I don't know what we're going to do. I'll suggest graduating to a little gator, maybe a little 1 or 2 foot. I'm just kidding. Is they're going to poop in the pool too?
Little pet gator. Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah,
maybe if you
I don't know.
Maybe you can get a little statue, like a little gnome gator or something. Maybe that'll keep the ducks out.
Yeah. We'll try the gnome. Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Just the regular gnome. I don't know that would work, but yep. So that's the latest. We have a duck problem.
Good stuff. That's good stuff. I don't know how we switch gears into the end times with that, but part 2 of chapter 7.
We do not have 144,000 ducks. How's that? There we go.
Have you ever seen those deals? If you would, what would you rather fight? Like 144 ducks? I can't. What is it? How's that go? Or like one big? Or would you rather fight one human-sized duck, or would you rather fight like 144 little ducks? What would you rather fight?
Yeah, I'll take the human-sized duck because you only got to use one bullet on it.
Okay. You know? Oh, well, okay. I didn't say weapons were allowed, but okay, I see what you did there.
Well,
yeah. You had to go hand to hand.
hand to wing. Okay. Yeah.
Hand to beat.
That's still my choice.
Okay, good. So
the other one's too labor intensive. You know, it's just there's too much work there.
Yeah. Well, Mike, I'm going to leave it up to you to transition here because it's all you.
Right. Well, okay, we'll just do it the simple way. We are back in Revelation 7. This is part 2, and we are talking about the 144,000. This time, you know, we sort of just went through the passage last time, talked about different features of it. You know, the number and whatnot, and, you know, just sort of different lines and things that pop up as you read through, especially, you know, the tribal arrangement, you know, the Old Testament connections back to this sort of thing, the number, you know, the census thing and the tribes and whatnot, whether they're protected or not. We sort of telegraphed it when we get to the point about, you know, the plagues being unleashed, that there's an allusion here in this chapter to that. And then that, of course, factors into the issue with the plagues of Egypt and were the Israelites protected, and if they were, the 144,000 protected. So we did some of that in part 1. And we reserved part 2 sort of for, you know, different topical approaches to this. And what we talked about last time was I alluded to the fact that when we get to part 2, we're going to talk about a possible connection with the Book of the Watchers. That's, you know, first 36 chapters of the Book of Enoch, and also the Antichrist from Dan tradition. And by the end of going through those two things, we actually will sort of also pick up a little bit of, you know, related to how this chapter is used or maybe shouldn't be used or something like that in regard to certain points of end times schemes or scenarios that people will be familiar with today. So I want to get into the Book of Watchers connection first. We're just going to take, you know, that and then the Antichrist from Dan idea, and then sort of mop up, you know, chapter 7 in this episode. And if you've read Reversing Hermon, my book, there's going to be some of this content in that book, but we're going to say a few more things about this issue, this possible connection, give you a little more detail here than I do in the book. And we'll do the same thing with the Antichrist from Dan tradition. And when I get to the Antichrist from Dan tradition, I'm going to have to be a little bit careful because, believe it or not, this is a trajectory in my 3rd novel. So I got to be a little cagey with that, but we'll step around that when we get to it here. So Book of the Watchers connection, Revelation 7, 1 through 8, of course, is the 144,000. And then there's another passage in which the 144,000 are mentioned. And this is the passage where there might be, again, some scholars argue for a possible connection back to the Book of the Watchers idea, or at least, you know, more broadly, the events of Genesis 6. Okay. So in Revelation 14, 1 through 5, that's the second passage, we read this. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. Again, this is ESV. Then I looked, and behold, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, and with him 144,000 who had his name and his father's name written on their foreheads. And I heard a voice from heaven like the roar of many waters, like the sound of loud thunder. The voice I heard was like the sound of harpists playing on their harps, and they were singing a new song before the throne. and before the 4 living creatures and before the elders. No one could learn that song except the 144,000 who had been redeemed from the earth. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. It is these who follow the Lamb wherever he goes. These have been redeemed from mankind as firstfruits for God and the Lamb. And in their mouth no lie was found, for they are blameless. So that's Revelation 14, 1 through 5. You see already, in the very first verse there, on Mount Zion stood the Lamb, with him 144,000 who had his name, the Lamb's name, and his Father's name written on their foreheads. So there we have the bearing the name concept, which should be familiar to this audience, through, Carmen Imes' work, and we've had her on the podcast, and we've talked about this before, that how this relates to imaging God, and these two concepts go together. Carmen's focus, of course, is Old Testament material, but, she drifts into the New Testament as well in her book, Bearing the Name. And this is representation. And in this, one of the specific Old Testament contexts is the high priest. So right away for a Jew listening to this, they're going to associate this language with broadly Israelites bearing the name of Yahweh, and specifically the high priest who like literally bore the name on his forehead. Okay, and that priestly context is going to be, part of, the part of the approach when it comes to this whole thing. Is there a connection to the Book of the Watchers? The key verse, though, is going to be verse 4. It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins. Now, let's just back up a little bit and think about the 144,000 as they are cast in this passage. They're in the heavenly Zion, okay, God's throne room. This is a divine council scene, all right. Verse 3, we have another reference to the throne and the cherubim, and, we go back, to Revelation 7 that follows on the heels of Revelation 4 and 5, pretty closely, and there hooks back into Revelation 4 and 5, the divine council scene. So we're in the heavenly Zion, God's throne room. We've got the cherubim here, the throne. It's the spiritual realm. Now, this is one reason why the 144,000 of chapter 7 are viewed as a different group. Okay, remember we talked about this in part 1. But why cannot John have have an earthly 144,000 who are then in the vision? Remember, this is a vision. Also before the throne of God. Perhaps this is some sort of commissioning scene. We talked about, is Revelation 7, or Revelation 4 and 5, I should say, is this a commissioning scene? Is it some other kind of way to look at this enthronement? Or, we went through all these different categories. And in the course of doing that, and then the course of the 144,000 in part 1, there was this division about whether Revelation 7 or Revelation 14 are two different groups. The majority of scholarship doesn't hold them as two different groups because this is a vision. There's no necessary reason why the 144,000, earthly can't also be present in heaven, and so on and so forth, because this is a visionary context. We're at the, we've seen these guys before. Is this, some sort of flashback, to their commissioning? I mean, who knows? There's any number of ways to argue that they don't have to be distinguished. We're going to set that aside and focus on verses 4 and 5 here, because we've already sort of covered, this other topic. Verses 4 and 5 mark them as virgins, specifically male virgins who have, quote, not defiled themselves with women. And then thirdly, they're playing on their harps. They're singing a new song before the throne. So this is this heavenly scene. And then we've got this sort of weird, almost feels like a throwaway line. Like what is the fact that they haven't defiled themselves with women? What does that have to do with a divine council, a throne room scene, a heavenly, scene in the divine abode and worship? And, what does that have to do with anything? It just seems like it sticks out like a sore thumb. Now, again, that's one of the obvious questions. There are others that go along with this, because again, the passage starts out with this bearing the name concept, which again, a Jew would associate with Israelites bearing the name. And let's not forget, Israelites were supposed to be, quote unquote, a kingdom of priests. And we've got the high priest who literally bears the name on his forehead. So here's a question we could bring to it. Are the 144,000 here portrayed as a heavenly priesthood? Now, we've actually talked about this before in relationship to the elders and that whole discussion of Revelation 4 and 5. We talked a little bit about how certain sects of Judaism had this notion of that they were on earth the mirror image, or the symbiotic, group that corresponded to the heavenly, the angelic priesthood. Okay, this is known from Qumran, the Shabbat Shirot, and so on and so forth. So this is a legitimate question. Are they portrayed as a heavenly priesthood? And again, one of the reasons you'd ask this question is the bearing the name concept, and also this, male virgin thing. Okay, so let's just proceed a little bit. We asked why this specific note, because Israelite priests could be married. I mean, there wasn't a rule against that. You go back in the Old Testament, you can see that very plainly. Now, last week we talked about how a few scholars, On and Balcom, suggested that the sexual abstinence here was part of a military motif. Practicing abstinence, sexual abstinence before going to war, and you'll find that in the Hebrew Bible. But if you think about that analogy, well, the warriors there, they weren't virgins. Okay, they might have abstained before going to battle, but they're not virgins. I mean, they're just not. Okay, so that doesn't seem to really work well. I mean, and you could still argue a military context, at least part of the context, on the basis of tribal arrangement, census, demonic opposition. I mean, you don't need this sexual abstinence motif to have the military flavoring of Revelation 7, the 144,000, be there. You have these other things that you can build the same argument out of. The abstinence idea is pretty weak, actually. And again, the virgin idea, specifically for some scholars, takes them in quite a different direction. Now, there are two scholarly studies on this passage that have argued that this description presents the 144,000 as priestly figures. Again, they're in the presence of God, they occupy sacred space, they're worshiping at the throne, they bear the name, okay? That they're priestly figures who are intended as an oppositional reverse analogy to the sexual defilement of God's other holy ones, who at one point occupied sacred space in heaven, but who did defile themselves by sexual engagement with women. And that would be the fallen sons of God of Genesis 6:1-4, or the Watchers, as they are known in Second Temple Jewish literature. Now, those two articles are D.C. Olson, and the title is Those Who Have Not Defiled Themselves with Women, subtitle, Revelation 14:4 and the Book of Enoch. That's from Catholic Biblical Quarterly, Volume 59, Number 3, 1997, pages 492 to 510. And then the second one is Terrell Manikam, I apologize if I'm mispronouncing that, and Jan A. Durand. The title here is The 144,000 Undefiled Levites. So it actually has it in the title, this priestly idea. The 144,000 undefiled Levites of Revelation 14:1-5, and the link to the defiled watchers of 1 Enoch 1-36. That's the title, long title. And the publication, the journal, is pretty obscure. In fact, this might be in my library of 7,000 or 8,000 journal articles that pertain to this sort of stuff. This might be the only article from this source. The Ecclesiasticos Pharos Journal, Volume 94, Number 1, 2012, pages 123 to 136. Now, I put both of these in the protected folder for anybody who's interested in them. In reversing Hermon, I really focus on Manikam and Durand's article. They reference Olson because Olson's was written, 1997. Theirs is 2012. So they interact with it. So I don't really bother in the book anyway, getting into the first one. But we're going to say a few things, here, drawn a little bit more from from Olson, so that you get the flavor for what he's arguing. But I'm still going to use, Manikam and Durand to do that. Again, you can access both of these articles in the protected folder if you want to. So they take note, Manikam and Durand take note of Olson's work, obviously, as I just noted, and they write this. This is one point where they sort of summarize some things. Olson argues that the redeemed 144,000 virgins, Revelation 14:4a, stand in radical opposition to the defiled fallen angels mentioned in 1 Enoch 1-36, who were engaged in sexual practices with the daughters of men, Genesis 6:1-4. According to Olson, the 144,000 virgins of Revelation 14 are an anti-image to not only the followers of the beast mentioned in the preceding chapter and Revelation 14 again, 6-20, and of course we get the beast in Revelation 17 and 18, but also to the fallen angels of 1 Enoch 1 through 36. He also argues that by contrasting the redeemed with the watchers, John is actually giving the 144,000 the role of good angels, unquote. Again, that's very interesting, especially since we've already talked a little bit about angelic priesthood, both, in some earlier episodes. If you've read Unseen Realm, you should be familiar with this idea. We did an episode on Hebrews 12, the cloud of witnesses. I mean, we've been on this topic before, this notion of angelic priesthood or believers, joining the council and so on and so forth. So this is actually part of that mix. Olson, this is one of the angles that he pursues. Now, Menachem and Durand try to develop Olson's observation by more observations of the Watcher's tradition, and they expand the idea to argue that the 144,000 represent the entire people of God in the manner of the Old Testament idea of substitution. What they mean by that is that the whole firstborn thing, the Levites take the place of the firstborn offering of everything else. This is Numbers 3, 40, and 41. Okay, so that, God is owed the firstborn, and the tribe of Levi sort of has this function in the Old Testament. So he's drawing on that as well. And this is actually alluded to in Revelation 14. These have been redeemed from mankind as first fruits for God and the Lamb. Okay, so this notion of substitution, a la, again, the firstborn, is actually mentioned in the passage. So Menachem and Durand are going to pursue that idea and a few other things from the Book of the Watchers to sort of build out Olson's argument. Now, for our purposes, really only the Watchers tradition is of interest, and we have to limit this somehow for this episode so we can get through Revelation 7. The other aspect, the firstborn, we're not going to do so much with that. But, I think Olson, I think this is a meaningful trajectory. I don't think his idea should be dismissed. I think this is, part of it. But in general, how do Menachem and Durand, with Olson, because they're on the same side too, how do they make these points? The idea that the 144,000 are a mirror opposition to the fallen watchers. So I'm going to just walk you through their arguments here. So what they do first is they go through some passages where Levites and angels do similar things, just general ministries. They look at different vocabulary for what angels do and then what Levites do, and note, hey, the same Hebrew lemma is used here. Okay, that sort of thing. So they write this: the Levites were, to a certain degree, God's holy ministering servants on earth, as compared to angels being God's heavenly servants. Let me just stop there. If you're already thinking of, again, this notion of how believers are going to be grafted into the council, and essentially replace what has been lost through rebellion in heaven. Again, this is all part of that matrix of ideas. So what they're suggesting here should be familiar to people in this audience who have, are familiar with the content of Unseen Realm and have been listening to the podcast for a while. So this is their beginning point, this simple observation. The Levites were to a certain degree God's holy ministering servants on earth, as compared to angels being God's heavenly servants. Okay, this is also the concept of imaging. Why there's plurals in Genesis 1. Again, this is all Unseen Realm content, how the plurality language in that passage somehow links God with humans, with the heavenly host to whom God is speaking. And again, it's not the Trinity. I'm not going to rehearse all that material here, but it basically sets up this relationship between us. We are God's imagers here in this, in the earthly sphere He has created for human habitation, and they are God's imagers in the spiritual world. Again, simple idea, very straightforward. So they reference here Hebrews 1:14, Numbers 3:5 through 9, Numbers 8:11, Deuteronomy 18:5. Okay, they give a number of examples, but here's one. For example, both the angels and Levites were engaged in the worship of God. That's pretty easy, straightforward example. Hebrews 1:6, Revelation 4:5, Deuteronomy 18:5. Now, they move away from this pretty quickly. So as an editorial note here, just on my own, I actually think this part of their argument is weak and could be a lot stronger. And I think it needs to be, because it's fairly central to where they're going to go. So I would suggest they need to strengthen this by working through the Second Temple material related to the idea of humans as the angelic priesthood. Again, Qumran is the example. That the Qumran community clearly saw themselves this way. And in the absence of a literal temple, they mime temple service out there in the desert. They're effectively casting themselves as the quote-unquote real Levites. Okay, we're the real priests here that kept heaven and earth in sync. Again, all you got to do is read anything on Qumran calendar, the whole disagreement, over that issue, why they separate from the Jerusalem priesthood. I mean, there's a lot more they could do with this, but they don't. So it's kind of disappointing, but it's still a legitimate point. If you want a quick article on that, again, I've referenced this before in earlier episodes. Devorah Demont, Men as Angels, the Self-Image of the Qumran Community. And that's from the book Religion and Politics in the Ancient Near East, Studies in Jewish History and Culture. It's a 1996 book. So she has a chapter in that. It's quite good. Secondly, here's the second trajectory they follow. So the first thing they say is, hey, there's this service relationship. Second, the watchers forsook their heavenly standing by defiling themselves with earthly women. In other words, they transgressed both the boundary between them and humanity, and in so doing, they despised the identity given to them by God. They thus no longer represent the holy ones of heaven. The opposite of this, in this argument, is the virginity. They have, quote unquote, not defiled themselves with women, unquote. The opposite of this is the virginity of the 144,000 and their election to represent believers, or if one prefers, Jewish believers. That goes back to part one, that whole argument. Number 3, the Levitical instructions about who priests should marry, that's Leviticus 21, contains language similar to that of Revelation 14 in regard to the 144,000. So yes, priests could marry. They're not, virgins, but nevertheless, we get instructions about who priests should marry and who they shouldn't. This is Leviticus 21, 14, and 15. A widow or a divorced woman or a woman who has been defiled or a prostitute, these he, the priest, shall not marry. But he shall take as his wife a virgin of his own people, that he may not profane his offspring among his people. Okay, that's one of the Levitical rules, for who priests should marry. So they're correct here. There's some of this language is picked up on, or at least there's an echo here in Revelation 14. Now, this description, again, this not defile themselves among women or with women. This description, it is argued by Monicam and Durand and Olson, is how first Enoch views what the watchers did. And here's what they think is a direct connection. So I'm going to read 1 Enoch 15, 1 through 9. So this is how the writer of 1 Enoch views what the watchers did. And you're going to see that there are thematically, and in terms of, if we compared the lemmas here with LXX of, Leviticus and Revelation, you're going to get some hits. You're going to get some matches here. But just conceptually, here's how the writer of 1 Enoch viewed the offense. 1 Enoch 15, verse 1. And he answered and said to me, and I heard his voice, Fear not, Enoch, thou righteous man and scribe of righteousness, approach hither and hear my voice. And go, say to the watchers of heaven, who have sent thee to intercede for them. Remember, the watchers try to get Enoch to be a negotiator with God. Okay, let us get out of the chains and the abyss and all that stuff, okay? So go, say to the watchers of heaven who have sent thee to intercede for them, you should intercede for men, and not men for you. Wherefore have ye left the high, holy, and eternal heaven, and lain with women, and defiled yourselves with the daughters of men, and taken to yourselves wives, and done like the children of earth, and begotten giants as your sons. And though you were holy, spiritual, living the eternal life, you have defiled yourselves with the blood of women, and have begotten children with the blood of flesh. And as the children of men have lusted after flesh and blood, as those also do who die and perish. In other words, you're behaving like mortals. Verse 5, Therefore have I given them wives also, that they might impregnate them and beget children by them, that thus nothing might be wanting to them on the earth. God says, this is why I let humans do this, because they need to perpetuate the species, all right? Verse 6, But you were formerly spiritual, living the eternal life, and immortal for all generations of the world, and therefore I have not appointed wives for you, for as the spiritual ones of the heaven, in heaven is their dwelling. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits of flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they were born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. That's the end of the passage. But it's very clear, origin of evil spirits, demons from this event. This is one of the more explicit passages. So consequently, the argument is when you hit Revelation 14:4 and you read, "It is these who have not defiled themselves with women, for they are virgins," that language is meant to be a mirror opposite of what the Watchers did. So the 144,000 are the other side of the Watchers' coin. Fourth trajectory that is used here. Since the 144,000 are seen in Revelation 14 in the heavenly temple, and they are opposite the Watchers in terms of purity and faithfulness, they also symbolically replace the Watchers. Hence, Monicam and Duran's summary of Olson, quote, "John is actually giving the 144,000 the role of the good angels," unquote. This, of course, also dovetails with the broader idea that believers replace the fallen council members, which is, that's wider than Genesis 6, but obviously this would play a big part of that. Now, as I noted in Reversing Hermon, that book, quote, "The theological point is that the 144,000 holy ones who fight the beast, the Antichrist, are counterparts to the holy ones who rebelled and defiled themselves with women. John telegraphs that these holy ones will help their earthly compatriots defeat the beast and rectify the impurity brought to earth by the Watchers." Again, I think there is something to this approach, but I'd like to see more thorough research done in defense of it. In other words, I like the content of Olson and Monicam and Duran's articles, but there are parts of the argument that need development, and I think could get further development. So this is sort of a dissertation topic, really. I'd like to see more thorough research into Revelation 7 and 14 with the Septuagint vocabulary, for instance, about the priests, aligning that plus or minus, with the Greek Enoch vocabulary. And then I'd like to see a thorough investigation of angelic priesthood texts. They're just things that they could do, I think, to make to add support, to bolster this argument, this trajectory. But right now, where I sit, looking at the work that exists on this point, I think there's something to it. I do think there's something to it. It let's put it this way: this has pretty good explanatory power. It's better than, this is like warriors in Israel who didn't have sex before going out to battle. That's actually quite weak. This is better. Doesn't mean it's the right, answer. So it's just better. It has more explanatory power, and I'd like to just see more done with it. Let's go on to number 2, Antichrist and Dan. And again, this is quite debatable. In Reversing Hermon, I'm just going to read you some parts of Reversing Hermon so we get into the subject. I take a sort of a less positive view of this in that book. And again, I have to be cagey here because I'm actually going to use this idea in its association with some other things in the third novel. But anyway, from Reversing Hermon, I wrote this. Dan had a checkered history. The tribe forsook its allotted inheritance in the south of Canaan and migrated north, appropriating the priest of Micah the Levite, who kept household gods and an idol in his house. That's Joshua 19:40-48 and Judges 18. The Danites eventually conquered the city of Laish and renamed it Dan, Judges 18:27 and 29, and this city became a cult center to Baal in later Israelite history. Earlier in Israel's history, instead of receiving a blessing from the dying Jacob like his brothers, the patriarch pronounced instead, quote, "Dan shall be a serpent in the way, a viper by the path that bites the horse's heels so that his rider falls backwards," unquote. Thanks for the blessing, Dad. That's not really a blessing. It's Genesis 49:17. To continue with what I wrote, Deuteronomy 33:22 contains the cryptic note that, quote, "Dan is a lion's cub that leaps from Bashan," unquote. And there's Bashan again, the creepy place. Now, these failures and passages associate Dan with rebellion against God, the region of Bashan, whose name in Canaanite would have been Bathan, serpent, and Baal worship at a location at the foot of Mount Hermon. Okay, so there's a lot going on there, all right? Back to what I wrote here. It is no wonder that some early church writers believed that the reason Dan was omitted from Revelation 7 was because the Antichrist, in other words, the enemy of the 144,000, would come from the tribe of Dan. That's a belief you'll find in early church writings. And then I quote C.E. Hill, who has a journal article that's a study of this idea, this tradition. He writes this: our first explicit mention of a Jewish Antichrist comes in the writings of Irenaeus, where it occurs already in tandem with the opinion that he will also spring from the tribe of Dan. This is his Against Heresies 5.30.2. Somewhat surprisingly, Irenaeus brings forth but two scriptural passages in support of Antichrist's Danite origin. The first is Jeremiah 8:16 in the Septuagint, which in English translation is, "We shall hear the voice of his swift horses from Dan. The whole earth shall be moved by the voice of the neighing of his galloping horses. He shall also come and devour the earth, and the fullness thereof, the city also, and they that dwell therein." Unquote. Continuing with Hill, he, Irenaeus, finds further support for this in the omission of Dan from the list of the 12 tribes of the sealed in Revelation 7:5-7. Little ellipsis here. Antichrist from the tribe of Dan makes his first known appearance in Irenaeus, but it is in Hippolytus that he finds his most scrupulous and eloquent biographer. Hippolytus's copious description proceeds on the principle that, quote, "the deceiver seeks to liken himself in all things to the Son of God," unquote. As Jesus was the lion from the tribe of Judah, referring to Jacob's blessing on Judah in Genesis 49:17, Antichrist will be the lion from the tribe of Dan, referring to Moses' blessing, or his words at least, on the tribe of Dan in Deuteronomy 33:22. So that's the end of the Hill quotation. Now, the difficulty with these ideas is that the Antichrist figure elsewhere, is pretty clearly Gentile. Isn't that interesting? And here, again, I have to be a little cagey. All I'm going to say, in Reversing Hermann, I brought up this point. So look, the Antichrist elsewhere is a Gentile. And of course, evangelicals assume that Antichrist means some sort of fake counterfeit Jesus, and so they opt for a Jew. But the Antichrist idea of the New Testament generates from, again, two Old Testament sources or ideas. The first is the Messiah must surely have a final day of the Lord enemy. In other words, that's not a counterfeit Messiah, but an enemy, an oppositional figure. Okay, like a supernaturally empowered warrior or a divine warrior that aligns himself against the divine warrior that is the Messiah. And therefore, it would make sense for a Gentile to be opposed to a Jewish Messiah. So that's one trajectory in the Old Testament. The second is that Daniel 9 and 11 get repurposed in the New Testament. If Daniel is accurate in historical terms in these chapters, the eschatological enemy of the people of God in that material was Antiochus IV, who was a Gentile. Okay, so this is what casts the Antichrist firmly in New Testament scholarship as a Gentile. Now let's go back here. We've got all that. And again, we sort of operate with this assumption. Again, the difficulty of these ideas, the Antichrist figures elsewhere is pretty clearly a Gentile. Okay, here's the question. And I'm not going to get into it here because this would be a whole episode, maybe 2 episodes. And again, it's a trajectory for my third novel. What if Dan was not an Israelite tribe? That would make Dan Gentile, wouldn't it? There's a historical problem with Dan and the Danite migration in Joshua and the book of Judges. And it goes like this. Again, this is very short form. And there are ways that you could acknowledge what I'm going to say here and still have Dan be an Israelite tribe who it would be and not be. In other words, there's one of the explanations for what I'm going to share with you here is that the original Jewish tribe of Dan in the south was either conquered or willingly assimilated people known as the Denyen or the Danunai or the Dan. There's like 3 or 4 different spellings of this here. So the Denyen, the Danu Naoi, the Danu, Danunen. I mean, again, there's a bunch of different spellings. It's a sea people tribe. It's a Gentile tribe from specifically the Aegean and even more specifically Mycenae. Now, if you've read my second novel, Mycenae should just make, the hair on the back of your neck stand up, okay? So there's this whole issue of, Dan. Why is Dan referenced later in the prophets? Dan, why did he stay in the ships, at a certain, battle? Why didn't he fight against, certain peoples in the promised land that were also sea peoples? Well, maybe it's because Dan was essentially a sea people tribe, or maybe it's because Dan was a seafaring tribe because that's what the sea people, you see all these things. This is again one of these little subset issues in Old Testament scholarship. It doesn't mean that there weren't 12 original tribes, including an original Jewish Dan tribe. But what it does mean is that Dan has problems. Okay. Dan could very well be conceived of as a group of sea peoples predominantly that usurp this tribe's position, migrate north, and do Gentile stuff, and basically become a problem, historically, theologically, religiously. And if that's the case, a Jew wouldn't have sort of been startled if you would have suggested that the Antichrist might come from Dan, and it works with Gentile typologies. That's a possibility. That's all I'm going to say here. Okay. So the Danite problem, the Danite migration problem, is an issue that might work, might contribute to a Dan Antichrist typology. Now, I don't discuss this in Reversing Hermon. Again, that would have been like adding 100 pages to the book, and I couldn't do that at that point. But you're going to see this again, okay? Again, if you read my fiction, that's where I get to play with it a little bit. But I'm telling you here because we should not dismiss the Danite Antichrist thing. And let's just say it more broadly. The great eschatological enemy thing, okay? The opponent of the eschatological Messiah and his people being a Gentile, Dan might be part of that picture. It might be part of that typology. We should not exclude that or dismiss it if we're committed to this great eschatological enemy being a Gentile. I think that's fairly obvious, okay, that he's not a Jew, but that doesn't exclude the Dan thing. Okay, enough said there. So, it's difficult to really say too much more about that, but that is the Dan Antichrist trajectory. And one of the prongs of it, one of the things that propels it, is probably a better way to say it, is the omission of Dan in, the 144,000 list. Now, you might recall from the first episode, part 1 here, that's not the only omission. Who else is omitted? Okay, usually, think of the 12, the original 12. Okay, Dan included, and Joseph. Okay, those are the 12 sons of Israel. Usually when Joseph is not included, in the tribal, lists, what do you get? We get his 2 boys, his 2 sons, half tribe of, Ephraim and Manasseh. Okay, guess which other, other than Joseph, he doesn't show up in a lot of tribal lists anyway. But his usual stand-ins, Ephraim and Manasseh, also do, there's an issue there. Guess which one of those is not in Revelation 7's list? Ephraim. Okay, why would that be significant? Well, because Ephraim was the capital of the apostate northern kingdom. Okay, and Ephraim, in Ephraim's territory, the whole of it, Bashan is included in Dan to Beersheba. Dan is in the north, okay? So Ephraim's not there either. So again, this is one of those things where there could be something to this, and we shouldn't dismiss it because of the Gentile part of the typology. So that to me, it really hinges on whether there's a Danite problem and how the Danite problem worked, which is probably an unanswerable question. What exactly happened here? But if something happened to make the other tribes suspicious of Dan, and that something at least included something of a Gentile composition in their people, okay, in the tribe, the tribe gets polluted. We'll just say it, with Gentiles. Okay, there's this. If that's the case, then that's on the table. It's on the table, when it comes to this other material. So let's move on. Again, there's a lot you can run around and do research on the Danite problem. Like I said, it's complicated, lots of facets to it, a number of different ways to address it. But that's a subject for 1 or 2 other episodes, and I don't know that we'll ever do that. But Again, you will see it in the novel, number 3. Third, let's just move on and mop up the chapter here. Revelation 7, 13, and 14. There's one other thing I want to get into here, and that is the phrase great tribulation. Okay, so let's go to Revelation 7, 13. Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, "Who are these clothed in white robes, and from where have they come?" And I said to him, "Sir, you know." And he said to me, "These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb." Okay, that's Revelation 7, 13, and 14. Now, I want to just say a few things about this phrase, because as soon as you say great tribulation, that phrase is going to be interpreted. It's going to be parsed in certain ways by certain end times systems. Okay, we were already talking about the Old Testament. We already talked, I should say, about the Old Testament context for the white robe imagery. Again, that in the verses I just read. We're not going to go back and rehearse all that, but I want to focus on this phrase. That's all we're going to do the rest of the episode. It does have an Old Testament context, and it's not what many in the audience might presume. The usual idea is great tribulation equals the 70th week of Daniel, but the concept of a 7-year tribulation never appears in Daniel 9, 24 through 27. Okay, when you get the 70th week talk. The closest you come is Daniel 9:25 in that mix. Let me just read this to you. Daniel 9:25. "Know therefore and understand that from the going out of the word to restore and build Jerusalem to the coming of an anointed one, a prince, there shall be 7 weeks. Then for 62 weeks it shall be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time." So the troubled time is again, a possible reference vocabulary associated with a tribulation period. But if you'll notice, this stuff happens. It'll be built again with squares and moat, but in a troubled time. This stuff would happen somewhere during the first 69 weeks. It's not the 70th week. Okay, the anointed one rises, and you have this building going on in a troubled time, and then it's only later that the anointed one gets cut off, and so on and so forth. So it's not a match. A lot of people think it is, but it's not if you actually look closely at what it's saying. So that's one problem. The other problem is the vocabulary for tribulation never occurs with the terminology for week or 7 in either the Old Testament or the New Testament. So the assumption that the Great Tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel, or the last 7 of Daniel, there's actually no textual support for that. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be. It means there's no textual support for it. There is, though, a better Old Testament context for the quote-unquote Great Tribulation language, and that is Daniel 12:1. I'm going to read Revelation 7, 13, and 14 again, just so that you have that ringing in your head. "Then one of the elders addressed me, saying, 'Who are these, clothed in white robes, and where have they come?' I said to him, 'Sir, you know.' And he said to me, 'These are the ones coming out of the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb.'" So let's take a look at the elements. Okay, we have Revelation 17, 13, 14. We just read that. It references a great tribulation. You're also going to get this language in the New Testament in Matthew 24, 21. Let me just read that for you. We might as well read that. Again, this is an eschatological passage, part of the Olivet Discourse here. "Pray that your fight," this is verse 20, "pray that your flight might not be in winter or on a Sabbath, for then," verse 21, "there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now, no, and never will be." So this is the ultimate, tribulation, okay? So you have this language in Revelation 7, 13, and 14, Matthew 24, 21. You have believers and martyrs on behalf of the Lamb who have gone through the great tribulation. That's Revelation 7. Okay, these are the ones who are coming out of the great tribulation. They've gone through the great tribulation. They're glorified because they have white robes. Their faith in the Lamb has saved them despite the great tribulation. Now, if the tribulation is at a close in Revelation 7, and basically all eschatological views are going to say that, then we're at the final day of the Lord judgment, which includes the great white throne, the book of life, and all that sort of stuff, because we got this glorification element and so on and so forth. Now, the context, Old Testament context. Here's Daniel 12:1. Just listen to Daniel 12:1 in light of Revelation 17, 7, 13 and 14, and then Matthew 24:21. Here's Daniel 12:1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince who has charge of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble, such as never has been since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, everyone whose name shall be found written in the book. Okay. Again, look at the elements and their overlap with Revelation 7, 13, and 14, and Matthew 24:21. You have an end of days tribulation. There's no number assigned to it. Doesn't say it's 7 years. Doesn't say it's anything. It's tribulation. And it's great because of the wording. Quote, this tribulation is such as never has been since there was a nation until that time. And because of that wording, scholars will link Daniel 12:1 to another Old Testament passage, Jeremiah 30, verse 7. I'll read that. Alas, that day is so great, there is none like it. It is a time of distress for Jacob, i.e. Israel, yet he shall be saved out of it. Now, this is the passage where you get the phrase time of Jacob's trouble, which, again, certain end time systems will marry to the 7-year Great Tribulation and consider that the 70th week of Daniel. Again, there's certainly a connection there, but there's no number in any of these passages, and there's no association with the weeks of Daniel. Again, that's a problem for specific systems, all right? But you have an end of days tribulation, and it's great, again, because that's the way it's worded. There's like this, never seen anything like this. It never will be again. Second element, the righteous are delivered, the people of God whose names are found written in the book. Okay, I think this is obviously the book of life. On here, to loop him in, he writes, part of a series of events associated with the arrival of the eschaton in early Judaism and early Christianity is in view here. I mean, this language in Revelation 7, 13, and 14 gets picked up in Second Temple Jewish literature. Okay, I say picked up because scholars think its source is Daniel 12 and Jeremiah 30 and so on and so forth. For instance, you got Testament of Moses 8:1, Jubilees 23, 11 through 21, 4th Ezra 13, 16, and 19, the second apocalypse of Baruch 27, 1 through 15. There are other, again, Jewish texts in the Second Temple period that pick up on these passages and talk about them in kind of the same ways that you're also going to see in Revelation 7, 13, and 14. So even ancient people associated this language from Daniel 12:1 and Jeremiah 37, with the apocalypse. And of course, Revelation is an apocalypse and so on and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of agreement here in terms of the ancient literature. Where there's disagreement is how modern end times systems, what they do with this and sort of information that gets added along the way. Now, On also writes this. Since the Danielic phrase time of distress, okay, this time of trouble, was interpreted as the time of the battle against the Kittim, that means Westerners, in 1 QM, that's the War Scroll, 1, 11, and 12, and chapter 15, verse 1. Since that's true, Bauckham suggests that the phrase, quote, those who emerge from the Great Tribulation, here in Revelation 7, 13, and 14, means, quote, those who emerge victorious from the eschatological war, okay, unquote. On continues and says, it appears that while the Great Tribulation belonged to a discrete series of events in Jewish eschatological expectation, early Christians regarded their frequent experience of persecution and opposition as part of this eschatological period of tribulation presaging the end. And preterists like that because that's essentially the preterist argument, at least in terms of the flavor of it. Now, Beale, and who's not a preterist, but Beale is going to express these ideas this way. He says, Daniel 12:1 is acknowledged as the likely origin for the idea of the Great Tribulation. Quote, there will be a time of tribulation, such tribulation as has not come about from when a nation was on earth until that time. That Daniel is in mind is also apparent from the fact that the phrase Great Tribulation occurs in the New Testament outside Revelation only in Matthew 24:21, where it is part of a fuller and more explicit reference to Daniel 12:1. He references Mark 13:19. He also references the War Scroll, so on and so forth, for these ideas. These are prophecies that God will protect the Israelite saints as they pass through the imminent, unprecedented time of distress prophesied in Daniel 12:1, after which they will be rewarded with eternal blessing. In Daniel's tribulation, the eschatological opponent persecutes the saints, because of their covenant loyalty to God. That's Daniel 11:30-39, verse 44, and also Daniel 12:10. Some will apostatize and persecute those remaining loyal, especially attempting to cause them to forsake their loyalty. Therefore, the tribulation consists of pressures to compromise the faith, these pressures coming both from within the church community through seductive teaching and from without through overt oppression. Sometimes the persecution is economically oriented. So you have thlipsis, the word tribulation in Revelation 2:9, to afflict. You get the same thing in Leviticus 26:26 in the Septuagint, where it refers to a famine of bread and distributing loaves by weight, which stands partly behind, in Beale's mind, Revelation 6:5-6. At other times, the tribulation is heightened to include imprisonment and even death, Revelation 2:10, thlipsis, tribulation. Whatever its nature, tribulation always comes because of believers' faithful witness to Jesus. The greatness of the tribulation, therefore, and again in Beale's thinking, is the intensity of the seduction and the intensity of the oppression through which believers pass. Now, another item here. If Revelation 3:10 is an allusion to Daniel 12:1, let's read Revelation 3:10. We'll go back there. We've hit this before. Because you have kept my word about patient endurance, I will keep you from the hour of trial that is coming on the whole world to try those who dwell on the earth. So if that's an allusion to Daniel 12:1, which would then be connected to Revelation 7:13 and 14, then one could argue, now catch this, one could argue that the Great Tribulation is yet another already but not yet element in biblical thought. Because Revelation 3 is addressed to the churches that are already boots on the ground. Okay, if Revelation 3:10 refers to Daniel 12:1, the writer sees this happening already, but then you're going to get these later passages where it's not yet. It's still something prospective. So the tribulation itself, this great end times tribulation, whatever it is, again, that people assume is the 70th week of Daniel, even though there's no textual support for that. Whatever that is, could be an already but not yet thing in the mind of the writer of Revelation. And that's actually Beale's position. Here's what he writes, just before we wrap up here. Indeed, the author of 1 Maccabees 9:27 understood that the great tribulation of Daniel 12:1 had already begun in the 2nd century BC, as a result of the chaos produced by Judas's death at the hands of Israel's enemy. This is Judas Maccabee. He writes, this is the writer of Maccabees 9:20, 1 Maccabees 9:27. So there was a great tribulation, thlipsis megale, in Israel, the like of which had not occurred since the time that a prophet was not seen among them, unquote. Midrash of Psalm 119:31 applies Daniel 12:10 tribulation prophecy to the afflictions of Israel throughout history. Okay, so, on and on and on. He lists a few other examples here, and he writes, we have seen that the hour of testing in Revelation 3:10 also alludes to Daniel 12:1 and Daniel 12:10, so he thinks they are connected, and that it appears to include the entire time before Jesus' ministry and the parousia, again, the second coming. If so, the present analysis of the tribulation in Revelation 7:14 is supported further, though others also see a parallel between 3:10 and 7:14. But see both as alluding to something in the future, a final trial at the very end of history. So what Beale is arguing is that could be already, but not yet. And again, that's where he lands because, Maccabees picks up the language and some other sources already. Again, the people of God are under oppression all the way a couple centuries BC, all the way through the 1st century when John is writing the book of Revelation. It's already, but it's not yet. It's already happening. Believers are under oppression, but not yet. At the end, the ultimate consummation of this persecution, this tribulation, has yet to come. So at the very least, let's just wrap up this way. At the very least, here's what can be said about the great tribulation of Revelation 7:13 and 14 in biblical thought. Number one, it's certainly connected to Daniel 12:1 and Jeremiah 37. I don't think there's any way to deny that. Number two, it's therefore linked to Matthew 24:21. Number three, it is a time that precedes the final judgment and return of Jesus. Remember the white robes, okay, the book of life. So it's a time that precedes that, and it involves persecution of believers. That's number four. That's about what you can say about the Great Tribulation for sure. Notice there's no reference to weeks. There's no time. There's no number of years. All of that kind of stuff is supplied or kept from being part of the equation by whatever your end time system happens to be. So we shouldn't be making assumptions that the Great Tribulation is the 70th week of Daniel. Hey, maybe that's the way it'll turn out. Who knows? Okay. But there isn't a verse to hang that on, is the point. Rather, it might be this already but not yet thing, again, which wouldn't necessarily exclude the former. But again, it'd be sure nice to have a verse for that numerical equation, but we don't have it. So again, ultimately, this is what you're left with. This is why we have different end time systems. This is why if you love one and you need this element in it for it to work, you're going to cheat. You're just going to say it and that works. And now we move on to the next point. If you don't like, that eschatological system, you're going to say there's not even room for discussing this. Forget it. Blah 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 blah. You're going to dismiss it from the realm of possibility just out of the gate. It's a non-discussion item. And so there you go. This is how systems work. Both sides are going to do this at different points to make their system beautiful, and they're all beautiful, except where they're not. Okay, they're all beautiful until something messes with them, which is why in this series we're not propping up an end times system. Okay, I just want you to be thinking about Old Testament antecedents to these ideas, to the content here of Revelation 7 here in part 2. So again, possible connection again to Genesis 6, i.e. the Book of the Watchers stuff, the way that's worded, the way that was taken in Second Temple Judaism, the way that was understood. And you've got the Danite problem, the great eschatological enemy. Does he have a relationship to Dan? Okay, that's again, there's data there for that, but again, we don't necessarily know for sure. And then third, the Great Tribulation. All these things have Old Testament precedent antecedents, and that's what we're trying to do in this series of the podcast. Just introduce you to these things so that you can think about them when you're studying, in this case, the Book of Revelation.
Mike, we want hard core answers here. We want to know the facts. We want to know exactly which one
you want.
Don't.
You want hardcore speculation.
Yeah, we want to pinpoint it down to one. Don't give us a bunch of them. We want the right.
That's what the
one.
Novel's for. Hardcore speculation.
That was my next thing. You mentioned that. So what's up with that? Can we expect that sometime soon?
Well, soon is a relative term, Trey.
2021.
It'd be nice to hand this off to my little circle of draft readers who help me with the first two, by the end of the year. That would be wonderful. So I don't know if anyone defines soon as early next year or not. I think that's probably the best timetable I can give you. But anyway,
okay.
That's where we're
definitely 2022 is what you're saying.
I would think so. Absolutely.
Okay, so you're guaranteed right now. You're willing to go on the record that 2022 is guaranteed.
I'm going to go out on that limb. Yes, sometime in 2020, December 31st, January.
Breaking news! You heard it here first.
2022,
guaranteed. All right, in time for Christmas 2022. There you go. All right. Well, that's good stuff. Mike, I also wanted to mention to people out there that we are going to do a Q&A of Revelation. So start gathering your questions. If you have some, you can go ahead and send those to me at treystrickland@gmail.com. In the subject, if you would, just please put Revelation Q&A or something so I can keep those together. But, or if you want to wait.
No questions about Dan.
To the
no
end.
questions about Dan. And no questions about ducks either. Okay.
Hey, why not? You're going to have to give us an update on the War of the Ducks.
That's right. Our apocalyptic war against these two ducks. So.
Exactly. All right. That's it, Mike. And with that, I think next week we're going to be doing a Q&A. So we'll be looking forward to Q&A next week. And with that, I want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.